June 9th, 1944, 3 days after D-Day, Berlin. The head of German military intelligence reads a priority cable from his most trusted agent in Britain. The message is marked urgent. Agent Arabel has been right every single time for 4 years. 27 sub-agents reporting from across the United Kingdom, financial records, troop movements, convoy schedules, never wrong, not once. And now, Arabel is saying something that changes everything. Normandy was a feint, a distraction. The real invasion, the one with Patton and the full armoured divisions, is coming at Pas-de-Calais. Hold the 15th Army. Do not move. The cable is passed up the chain of command. It reaches the highest level. The order goes out. 150,000 German soldiers of the 15th Army remain exactly where they are, dug into positions along the Pas-de-Calais coast, waiting for an invasion that will never come. Meanwhile, on the beaches of Normandy, the Allied breakout begins. The window that General Eisenhower needed, the window where German reserves could not reach the beachhead in time, stays open. Thousands of men who should have died that week do not die. The critical first weeks of the Normandy consolidation pass without the one German counterattack that could have ended it. D-Day holds. Not because of a general, not because of a weapon. Because of a single message from a single agent sitting in a house in North London, entirely alone, knowing exactly what he has just done. There is one detail that nobody in Berlin knows. Arabel does not exist. His 27 sub-agents do not exist. His contacts in Glasgow, Cardiff, Liverpool, and Brighton do not exist. Every report, every cable, every intelligence dispatch he has sent to Germany for 3 years, fabricated. Written from memory and from library books and from railway timetables and from second-hand knowledge of British geography picked up from Portuguese tourist pamphlets. Every single word constructed by one man alone in a rented room with no training, no network, no government backing, and no real confirmation for most of that period that any of it was working. His name was Juan Pujol García. He was 32 years old. Before the war, he had managed a small hotel and kept chickens. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Because before Juan Pujol Garcia became Garbo, the codename MY5 would eventually give him. Named after Greta Garbo because, as his British handler later put it, he was the greatest natural actor they had ever encountered. Before all of that, he was something harder to categorize. He was a man who had made a decision. Not a military decision, not a political calculation, a personal one. He had decided, sometime around 1940, that he was going to do something about what was happening to Europe. He had no army. He had no connections. He had no resources and no authority of any kind. He just had the decision, and he was willing to follow it wherever it led, regardless of how strange or dangerous the path became. To understand that decision, you have to go back to Barcelona in the 1930s, the Spanish Civil War. Juan Pujol Garcia was 23 years old when the fighting began in 1936. The son of a prosperous textile manufacturer, educated, multilingual, with no strong political convictions at the outset. He watched both sides fight. He watched the nationalists under Franco, backed and equipped by Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. He watched the Republicans, supplied by the Soviet Union and supported by idealists arriving from across Europe. He served briefly on each side, because survival in that war sometimes required changing uniforms without changing what you believed. What he witnessed on both sides crystallized into something specific and durable. He had seen what ideological extremism did to ordinary people. He had seen what it looked like when a government decided that certain lives did not count. He did not forget. The Civil War left Spain with a specific kind of wound. Not the clean wound of a country that had fought and lost, but the complicated wound of a country where the same streets contained both the victors and the people the victors had defeated, and everyone was expected to go on living together as if the preceding 3 years had not happened. For Pujol, who had served on both sides and committed fully to neither, the post-war atmosphere in Madrid was suffocating in a way that was difficult to explain without sounding dramatic. He managed his hotel. He watched the news. He watched the German newsreel footage in the cinemas of Madrid showing panzer columns rolling through Belgium and France. And he watched the Spanish audience's reaction. And he felt something harden in him that would not soften again. By 1939, the Civil War was over. Franco had won. Spain was officially neutral in the European war that followed. But Franco's sympathies were clear enough to everyone who was paying attention. Pujol was living in Madrid, managing a hotel, watching Germany sweep across France, watching Britain stand alone after Dunkirk. He had married Araceli Torres, a woman from a nationalist family whose connections would prove unexpectedly useful. He had a small business. He had a quiet domestic life. He also had, growing every month, a completely private and entirely unsupported conviction that he personally needed to do something about the situation. Not because anyone asked him to. Not because he had a plan, because he could not tolerate the alternative. In early 1941, Juan Pujol García walked into the British embassy in Madrid and offered his services as an intelligence operative. He spoke no English. He had no contacts, no access to classified information, no training of any kind in intelligence work. He simply told the duty officer that he wanted to help defeat fascism and believed he had something to offer. The British officer who received him listened and declined. MI5 had protocols about walk-ins. You did not recruit untrained civilians off the street regardless of their sincerity. They thanked him and showed him out. He came back 2 weeks later. He was turned away again. He returned a third time. They turned him away a third time. The British had no interest in Juan Pujol García. He decided to find someone who did. What he reasoned next was either brilliant or reckless, and historians have argued about which for 80 years. If the British would not recruit him as a spy, perhaps the Germans would. And if the Germans recruited him as an agent in Britain, and believed he was actually in Britain, he could feed them false information. He could become a double agent on his own initiative, without anyone's authorization. All he needed was German trust. To get German trust, he needed to convince them he was already inside Britain, already running agents, already delivering results. He was not in Britain. He was in Lisbon, Portugal, which he reached by presenting himself at the German embassy in Madrid as a committed fascist sympathizer willing to work for the Reich. The Abwehr, German military intelligence, was considerably more receptive than the British had been. They maintained a constant appetite for sources inside Britain, which was in 1941 an extremely difficult country to penetrate. They gave Pujol a brief introduction to secret writing, a simple cipher, a supply of invisible ink, and $300 American. They instructed him to travel to Britain, establish contacts, recruit agents, and report regularly. He agreed to all of it. He went to Lisbon instead. He rented a small pension, purchased a British railway timetable, a map of the London Underground, a guidebook to England, and a Portuguese-English dictionary. He sat down at a desk and began composing reports about a country he had never visited, from agents he had never met. His research was methodical. He read British newspapers available in Lisbon and studied the pattern of what information appeared in the press versus what a genuine intelligence source would need to obtain through other means. He studied British rail schedules to ensure that the travel times his agents required were consistent with actual transit distances. He memorized the organizational structure of British military units and the geography of Britain's southern and western ports. He built 3 initial agent personas with care: a commercial traveler moving between cities who had access to port facilities, a South American businessman in Glasgow with shipyard connections, and a Venezuelan student near London who had cultivated relationships with officers at a local military base. None of these people existed. Each of them had a name, a history, a personality, a specific financial motivation, and a credible reason to be in the places they were supposedly reporting from. The work was lonelier than anything he had prepared for. He had no feedback mechanism. He sent dispatches into a void and received payments in return, which was the only evidence that someone was reading what he wrote and finding it credible. He had no contact with British intelligence, no way to calibrate whether his information was causing harm somewhere he could not see, no confirmation that the picture he was building in the minds of German analysts was the picture he intended to build. He wrote, He received payment. He wrote more. The silence on the other side of the transaction was, he later said, the most unnerving aspect of the entire first year. He had invented a network of agents and a relationship with an enemy intelligence service, and had absolutely no idea whether either of them was real in any sense that mattered. He made errors. Some were significant. In one early report, he described British troops buying wine at a railway station where, according to standard British railway guides, no wine had ever been sold. In another, he placed a naval installation 40 miles from its actual location, close enough to suggest local knowledge, far enough to be wrong. He described Scottish geography and culture in ways that a genuine Scotsman would find slightly off. These mistakes troubled him. Any competent counterintelligence review should have caught them. The Abwehr filed his reports, forwarded them up the chain, and continued paying. They were getting what appeared to be results. Arabelle was confirming things the Abwehr already believed about British military organization and deployment. Nobody looked closely at the wine. By mid-1942, Pujol had been operating his fictional network for over a year without exposure. His reliability was rated high. His reports were reaching senior levels of the Abwehr. He was receiving regular, substantial payments to fund operations that did not exist, to reimburse expenses that had never been incurred, to compensate agents who had never been recruited. He was succeeding by every available metric, except the one that mattered. His intelligence was going to Germany. It was helping nobody he actually wanted to help. He returned to the British Embassy in Lisbon for the fourth time and arrived with evidence. 18 months of coded correspondence with German military intelligence. The British listened. The initial reaction at MI5 was professional skepticism. The story was too unusual. A Spanish civilian with no training, self-recruited by the enemy, operating a fictional agent network in a country he had never visited, for over a year without detection. It resembled, uncomfortably, the kind of story a German plant would tell as a cover. The files were assigned to Thomas Harris, a senior case officer who was himself half Spanish and entirely fluent. Harris spent 3 weeks reading everything Pujol had produced. His conclusion, which he delivered carefully and with unusual confidence, was that the material was genuine, that the operation was exceptional, and that Juan Pujol García had built entirely on personal initiative the structural foundation of a deception campaign that MI5 had been attempting to construct for years through official channels. They flew Pujol to London in April 1942 and gave him a new codename, GARBO, for the performance. The apartment in Hendon, in North London, became the operational centre of what would evolve into the most consequential intelligence deception in the history of the Second World War. Pujol was assigned Thomas Harris as his case officer, collaborator, and co-writer. The two men worked together almost daily for 3 years. Together they expanded Garbo's network from 3 fictional agents to 27, each with a distinct name, a personal history, a specific expertise, a location within Britain, a financial arrangement with Arabelle, and a psychological profile detailed enough to sustain years of consistent, cross-referenced correspondence. Harris later said the work resembled more than anything else in his professional experience, writing a very long novel in which your publisher had the authority to have you executed for continuity errors. The scale of what they were managing required systems that did not previously exist. Harris and Pujol developed a card index of every agent, their locations on any given date, their financial accounts, their relationships with other agents, their specific areas of knowledge, and the limits of what they could credibly be expected to know. When the Abwehr sent a question to Arabelle about troop movements in Scotland, the index determined which agent could plausibly have the answer, whether that agent had been in Scotland recently enough to have obtained it, and what the logistical and financial implications of their having obtained it would need to be. The answers had to be consistent not only with the question, but with the entire history of the network, going back to 1941. They were building, in effect, a bureaucratic structure for maintaining a very large number of simultaneous lies. and the bureaucracy had to be more reliable than most real bureaucracies are. The deception worked because Pujol understood something precise about how intelligence is consumed at the institutional level. Information does not arrive at decision-makers clean. It arrives filtered through layers of analysts, each engaged in confirming existing theories rather than testing new ones. The Abwehr had a theory about Britain, that it was organized, penetrated, accurately reported on by their network. Arabelle confirmed that theory with every dispatch. The Germans were not deceived because they were incompetent. They were deceived because Arabelle was telling them what they already believed, in language they recognized, through a relationship they had invested in and could not afford to abandon. He was not fooling them. He was inhabiting the version of reality they had constructed and steering it carefully from the inside. The technical operation was precise and demanding. Pujol wrote in the invisible ink developed by the Abwehr. MI5 decoded each message before it was re-prepared and sent through the courier chain via Lisbon, arriving at German intelligence headquarters looking exactly like what it was supposed to look like. GARBO maintained complete, cross-referenced records of every agent's activities, their travels, their expenses, their reports, their personalities, ensuring that no document created a logical impossibility anywhere in the archive. When the Abwehr asked follow-up questions, answers were ready within hours. When an agent was supposed to have traveled somewhere, that travel was already documented with geographic and logistical specificity sufficient to survive scrutiny. The operation was, from the outside, a small bureaucracy dedicated entirely to the careful management of a fiction on a strategic scale. The invisible ink itself was a technical system of some sophistication. The Abwehr's formulation required a specific developer solution to reveal the writing, a compound that German couriers carried separately from the letters themselves to ensure that interception of either alone was insufficient to expose the content. Pujol had been taught the preparation and application procedure during his brief training period in Madrid. The letters he sent from Lisbon and later from London were written on ordinary notepaper with innocuous overt text covering topics a genuine Spanish sympathizer might plausibly communicate, and the real content written between the lines in a compound that disappeared on drying and reappeared only under the correct chemical treatment. MI5 had the developer formulation from early in the war. Every message Pujol sent was read in London before it was forwarded. Every message that reached the Abwehr had already been seen, assessed, and approved. He calibrated error into the system deliberately. No human intelligence network is perfect, and a source that never makes mistakes reads as suspicious rather than reliable. Pujol allowed his agents to produce information that turned out to be slightly incorrect at a rate consistent with realistic human intelligence collection, often enough to be credible, never on questions where the error would materially damage Allied operations. He was not just producing false intelligence. He was producing a false intelligence network that behaved exactly as a real one would, including its imperfections, its occasional miscommunications, its human texture of minor inconsistencies that confirmed, rather than undermined, its authenticity. The first major operational test came in November 1942 with Operation Torch, the Allied landings in North Africa. Pujol was given advanced knowledge of the operation and instructed to transmit a warning to Germany. The warning had to arrive. Too early and it could influence German defenses. Too late and it would make Arabelle look like a poor source. Pujol transmitted it with 48 hours to spare. Accurate, verifiable, operationally useless. The Abwehr filed it as a confirmed hit. Their assessment of Arabelle's reliability increased. MI5 noted the result and moved to the next problem. The relationship with Germany was consolidating exactly as planned, building toward the moment when it would matter most. The year 1943 was the year GARBO's network achieved something that no deliberate MI5 deception plan had managed to accomplish independently. It became, from the Abwehr's perspective, the most reliable single source of British order of battle intelligence they possessed. New agents were added with care: a Welsh nationalist with access to military railway movements in Western England, a widow who had cultivated friendships with officers' wives and gathered social intelligence of operational value. A Ministry of Information employee who leaked internal communications assessments. Each existed only in the files. Each had a complete personal history, a consistent character over years of correspondence, and a credible reason for their loyalty to Arabelle personally, rather than to Germany abstractly. The Abwehr received regular requests to fund their activities. They paid without hesitation. They were investing in infrastructure they believed was theirs. It was not theirs. The financial scale of what the Abwehr was underwriting tells its own story. By the end of 1943, the German payments to Arabelle's network totaled more than £20,000, a figure that, at wartime exchange rates, represented a substantial operational budget for a real intelligence network. The money funded fictitious travel expenses, non-existent safe houses, imaginary courier costs, and the regular stipends of 27 agents who did not exist. Pujol tracked every payment in his records with the precision of a legitimate accountant, because the Abwehr occasionally asked for financial reconciliation, and the numbers had to hold. The operation had, at its technical core, the structure of a medium-sized private business, managed with real discipline, audited by a hostile client, and delivering a product that was entirely fabricated. The hostile client never noticed the difference. For Pujol, who had started this with $300 and a train timetable in a Lisbon pension, the arithmetic was its own kind of satisfaction. He had decided to fight fascism with whatever he had. What he had turned out to be enough. By early 1944, the stakes had changed completely. Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of northern France, was in final preparation. Its success depended on Germany misreading where the blow would land. The deception plan was Operation Fortitude. Its architecture was the fictional 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG, supposedly massing in southeastern England under General George Patton, the German High Command's most feared Allied commander. The Allies constructed supporting evidence: false radio traffic, visible dummy encampments, decoy vehicles, a fake headquarters with real administrative activity. What the construction required was a trusted source inside German intelligence to confirm it as genuine. There was only one candidate with the established credibility to make the confirmation stick: GARBO. Pujol threw himself into Fortitude completely. His agents began reporting systematically on FUSAG, troop movements observed near railway stations, equipment sightings on southeastern roads, overheard conversations in pubs near military installations in Kent and Essex. One agent, the fictional Welshman designated 4, provided detailed observations from near Patton's headquarters, including the general's daily movements and logistical indicators of major embarkation preparations. Another fictional agent, a disgruntled Greek seaman recruited 18 months earlier, reported multiple sightings of amphibious training exercises off the Essex coast. The picture Arabelle was constructing was consistent, corroborated, and unambiguous. The main invasion force was in the southeast, aimed at Calais. Anything that happened at Normandy would be secondary. The fictional army Garbo was describing had a specific, detailed architecture that made it credible to German analysts who were cross-referencing Arabelle's reports against other sources. FUSAG was supposedly organized into 2 army groups, the 1st Canadian Army and the 3rd United States Army, with a combined notional strength of approximately 1 million men across more than 50 divisions. Individual unit designations were provided in Garbo's reports. Unit insignia were observed on vehicles by his agents. Specific commanders were named in overheard conversations. The Allies supported the fiction with fake radio traffic generated by signals units operating on authentic military frequencies, producing a traffic pattern consistent with a headquarters of the claimed scale. German signals intelligence was listening and reporting that the traffic was real. Garbo was confirming what German intelligence was independently detecting. The 2 streams of false information were reinforcing each other, and neither pointed toward Normandy. If this story is landing the way it should, hit the like button now, because we're about to reach the moment where everything almost falls apart. Not once, but twice. And how Pujol navigates it is, I think, the most technically impressive thing he did in the entire war. The Germans are about to start asking questions. The operation is about to become dangerous in a completely different way than it had been before. Back to the spring of 1944, and a man alone in a house in London, writing letters to the enemy about people who don't exist, in a country he invented, describing an army that isn't there. He's been doing this for 3 years. In a few weeks, it will either mean everything or nothing. June 5th, 1944, 11:55 at night. Juan Pujol García sits at his desk in Hendon and composes a message to the Abwehr. The intelligence is accurate. A major Allied assault is imminent, aimed at the Normandy coast. The message has been timed by MY5 to arrive in Berlin after the ships have already sailed and the troops are already in the water. It is real information, sent at a time calculated to make it impossible to act on real information. He sends it at midnight. The invasion begins at 6 the following morning, June 6th. 156,000 Allied troops cross the English Channel and land on 5 beaches along the Normandy coast. The German defense is fierce and, in places, catastrophic for the attackers. Omaha Beach costs American forces heavily in the first hours. The critical question from the opening day forward is whether Germany will commit its strategic reserve. Whether the 15th Army will be released from Pas-de-Calais to drive south and push the beachhead back into the sea before it can consolidate. That question stays open for 3 days. Some German generals argue for immediate commitment regardless of intelligence assessments. Hitler holds the decision himself. He is waiting for confirmation that Normandy is the main effort and not the feint. June 9th, 3 days in. The beachhead is expanding but fragile. The 15th Army has the men and the armor to make a decisive difference if deployed immediately. The window exists, barely. And then Arabelle's cable arrives in Berlin. It argues with the authority of 3 years of reliable reporting and the corroboration of multiple agents that the analysis is definitive. Normandy is a deliberate feint, designed to pull German mobile reserves away from the real objective. The main Allied force, Patton's army, is still in southeastern England. The blow is coming at Calais. Hold the 15th Army. The cable is forwarded to the highest level. The annotation on the copy, in the handwriting of the man who has to make the decision, reads, "Arabelle is correct. Normandy is a diversion. Hold." There is a dimension of the June 9th message that does not appear in the strategic analyses. The cable was not simply transmitted and received. It was assessed by multiple senior German intelligence officers, each of whom brought their professional judgment to bear on whether Arabelle's analysis was credible. Each concluded it was. The credibility of the message was the accumulated weight of 3 years of reliable correspondence. Thousands of individual decisions by one man in a rented house in North London, each of which had contributed a small increment of trust to an account he was now drawing on completely. The message worked because everything before it had worked. The operation was not one moment of brilliance. It was 3 years of sustained invisible labor that made one moment of brilliance possible. The weeks immediately after D-Day were the most operationally dangerous period of the entire mission. Not because of anything physical, because the Abwehr was under institutional pressure and scrutinizing its sources more carefully than before. Arabelle had sent a Normandy warning that arrived too late to be useful. Some analysts were asking uncomfortable questions about why the timing had been poor. A cable arrived at Arabelle's address expressing concern. It was not an accusation. It was a signal that the relationship was under review. Both Pujol and Harris recognized it for exactly what it was. The wrong response would end the operation and potentially end Pujol in ways that went beyond losing his position. What Pujol wrote back was not defensive. It was furious. He was outraged, specifically, carefully, and convincingly outraged, that 3 years of reliable service delivered at personal risk had produced a formal communication questioning his performance. He had protected his network. He had protected his agents. He had provided intelligence consistently accurate and consistently validated by German operations. If the Reich could not distinguish genuine service from failure, then perhaps Arabelle had made a serious mistake about which side deserved his loyalty. He demanded a formal statement of confidence from senior leadership. He threatened to cease all operations until he received one. It was a performance of wounded professional pride, so precisely calibrated that the Abwehr analysts reviewing it concluded that no agent constructing a cover story would have written it this way. An innocent man with Arabelle's record would be furious. Arabelle was furious. Arabelle was therefore innocent. The response arrived within 10 days and was, by any standard, remarkable. The Abwehr apologized formally. They affirmed their complete and unqualified confidence in Arabelle's network and in his personal reliability. They increased his monthly operational payments. And then, in recognition of his outstanding and sustained contribution to German intelligence operations, they informed him that he had been nominated for the Iron Cross, second class. He accepted. To decline would have raised questions. MI5 recorded the notification and filed it alongside the rest of the GARBO archive. Their agent had just been formally decorated by the country he had spent 4 years destroying from the inside. The relationship Pujol maintained with his Abwehr handlers across thousands of messages had, over 3 years, developed the kind of texture that any long professional relationship develops through sustained correspondence. He knew their names, their habits, their institutional anxieties, their personal investment in Arabelle as a source. He knew which handlers pushed back with questions and which accepted reports at face value. He had calibrated the relationship to produce a specific kind of trust, earned rather than assumed, resilient to small failures because it had been built on consistent performance on larger ones. The Abwehr men who corresponded with Arabelle believed they knew him, understood him, could predict him. They believed they had an asset they had managed. They had been managed instead. The German intelligence apparatus that GARBO was deceiving was not, it should be said plainly, composed of incompetence. The Abwehr contained genuine professionals with genuine successes in other theaters of the war. The vulnerability that Pujol exploited was structural. Intelligence organizations in any era develop an institutional tendency to evaluate information against the established credibility of sources, rather than on the internal consistency of individual reports. Arabelle had established credibility. That credibility had become self-reinforcing within the system. A source with Arabelle's track record produced reports that were assessed as reliable, partly because Arabelle was the source. The system had made him effectively impossible to doubt from the inside. After the Allied breakout from Normandy in August 1944, the strategic logic of the Fortitude deception became irrelevant. The fictional fusag was quietly dissolved as real Allied armies advanced east through France. GARBO's network continued operating through the autumn, producing increasingly routine reports on questions that no longer carried operational urgency. The Abwehr itself was simultaneously collapsing. Admiral Canaris had been arrested in February following discovery of his contacts with Allied intelligence, and the organization was being absorbed into the SS security structure under Kaltenbrunner. The institutional memory of Arabelle's value was dissolving along with the institution that had held it. A new risk was emerging. As Germany's position deteriorated and the intelligence apparatus was dismantled and examined, the possibility existed that captured files, or the testimony of arrested officers, would trace Arabelle's operational details to Juan Pujol García, a Spanish civilian in England, protected by neither uniform nor diplomatic status. The outcomes, if identified, range from a war crimes proceeding in a state that might not cooperate with British extradition requests to outcomes considerably more immediate and less formal. MI5 evaluated the situation and made a decision. Juan Pujol García would be removed from risk. He would die. In early 1945, a message reached the Abwehr from one of Arabelle's sub-agents. Arabelle had contracted malaria, likely acquired, the message explained, during a recent intelligence mission to Africa. His condition had deteriorated rapidly. He had died on a specific date and had been buried with minimal ceremony, to avoid attracting attention to a man whose identity needed to remain protected. The Abwehr sent a formal letter of condolence to Arabelle's widow, expressing deep regret for the loss of the finest British intelligence asset they had ever cultivated. The letter arrived at a real address in England. It was read by a healthy man who was simultaneously reviewing travel documents for Venezuela. He was 33 years old. He had been, for 4 years, the most consequential spy in the Western War. He was, as of that letter, officially a ghost. He arrived in Caracas in August 1945, under a new name with a modest amount of money and no public identity connecting him to anything that had happened in Europe. He opened a small shop, then a bookshop, which is either the most fitting or the least dramatic possible ending for someone who had spent 4 years writing the most elaborate fiction in the history of warfare. His wife Araceli, whose own wartime behavior had been considerably more complicated than the official account suggested, left him within a few years, taking their 3 children. He lived alone in Caracas. He spoke to no one about what he had done. He was, formally, a man who did not exist. The daily life he built in Caracas was by all accounts genuinely ordinary. He ran the bookshop with care and some apparent pleasure. He read widely. He learned Portuguese. He followed European news in the press with the specific, private attention of someone who understood the context of what was being reported in ways that nobody around him could know. He was not unhappy, as far as anyone could tell, though the people who knew him in those years later noted that he had the particular quality of self-sufficiency, common to people who have spent long periods in situations where there was no one they could talk to honestly about anything that actually mattered. He had been that person for 4 years during the war. It had apparently become a natural condition. For nearly 4 decades, the GARBO files remained sealed in the National Archives. Historians writing the early accounts of D-Day and Fortitude knew that a double agent had played a central role, but could not identify him. The code name appeared in classified histories as an unnamed Spanish agent, a narrative function without a face. In Caracas, Juan Pujol García was selling second-hand books to people who passed money across his counter without any idea they were dealing with the man whose reports had, on a single June day in 1944, held a German army of 150,000 soldiers at the wrong coast, while the largest military operation in history consolidated the beaches that would win the war. The story re-emerged in the mid-1970s as classification periods began to expire. Nigel West, a British historian researching the architecture of Allied deception operations, traced the GARBO trail through the declassifying files and followed it to Venezuela. He found a man named Juan Pujol García, 60 years old, living alone and quietly in Caracas. West asked if he would speak. Pujol considered the question for a period that West later described as longer than comfortable. He said yes. The book they published in 1984 produced in military history and intelligence circles the kind of quiet explosion that occurs when a story everyone assumed was already known turns out to be nothing like what anyone had imagined. Juan Pujol García appeared publicly for the second time in June 1984 at the 40th anniversary commemorations of D-Day on the beaches of Normandy. He was 72 years old, white-haired, dressed in an unremarkable suit, visibly moved by a ceremony most of those attending could not know he had helped make possible. Prince Philip, representing the British royal family, shook his hand. Most people present had no idea who he was. A small number of people in that group understood exactly what the handshake represented and said nothing. Pujol walked to the water after the ceremonies and stood alone at the edge of the beach for a moment, looking out at the channel. There is no photograph of this. There is no record of what he said or whether he said anything at all. In the years after the book was published, Pujol gave occasional interviews to historians and journalists. He was careful in them, not evasive but precise, consistently declining to be turned into a symbol for things he did not consider himself to represent. He had not been courageous in the way that word was usually used, he said in one interview. He had simply been stubborn. He had wanted to do something and had kept doing it until it worked or until it stopped working. It had worked. He was not sure that counted as courage, and he was genuinely uncertain whether the distinction mattered. The interviewers generally pressed him to say that it did. he generally declined to agree. There is a question at the center of what Juan Pujol García did that the documentation cannot resolve and that nobody who knew him well was able to answer clearly afterward. He was not brave in the way that word is usually applied to wartime service. He never carried a weapon. He never entered enemy territory. He was never in physical danger in any direct sense. What he did was sit at a desk and write letters, for years, to people who would have killed him if they had known what he was doing. The specific quality his work required, the ability to sustain, without institutional support, without feedback, without confirmation of impact, a fiction complex enough to deceive the most powerful intelligence apparatus in Europe, is not well described by the vocabulary we normally use for military courage. It is something rarer and harder to name. He received 2 formal decorations. The Iron Cross, second class, awarded by the German Reich in August 1944, for outstanding intelligence service rendered to Germany by Agent Arabel. Service that had, by that date, already ensured the success of the Allied invasion that would destroy the Reich within the year. The member of the Order of the British Empire, awarded by King George VI in November 1944, for exceptional service to the Allied cause by a civilian operative working under the codename GARBO. Both decorations are authentic. Both were awarded to the same man. Both recognize the same body of work from opposite directions. Juan Pujol García remains, as far as historians have been able to determine, the only individual formally decorated by both sides of the Second World War for the same operation. There is a final detail that took years to fully surface after the GARBO files were declassified. When analysts reviewed the archived Abwehr cables from the first weeks of June 1944, they found that Arabel's message on the 9th had not merely been accepted, assessed, and filed at the operational level. It had been forwarded to the highest levels of the German command structure, where the decision to hold the 15th Army was made. The historians who have reconstructed the chain of transmission most carefully have concluded that the cable reached the OKW, the Wehrmacht High Command, and directly informed the order that kept the 15th Army in place. One man, writing alone at a desk in North London, had placed words into the decision-making process of the most dangerous military command in the world, and made them stick long enough to change the outcome of the war. Juan Pujol García died in Caracas, Venezuela, on the 10th of October 1988. He was 76 years old. His obituaries, where they ran, called him a spy. That is accurate in the technical sense and insufficient in every other. What he had been was something history does not produce often and does not easily categorize. A man who, without authorization from any government, without training, without resources, without the company of anyone who knew what he was doing, decided that he was going to fight a war, invented the weapon he would fight it with, built the infrastructure he needed from scratch, sustained it for 4 years, through nothing except intelligence and nerve, and used it at the exact moment when it mattered most to change the outcome. The Iron Cross and the MBE were together in a drawer in his apartment in Caracas for 40 years. There is no record of whether he ever took them out. There is no record of whether he needed to.